If you've ever thought that Superman is a boring character, then I urge you to stay to watch the end of this video as I explain my experience with Superman and how I thought exactly the same up until watching a recent Superman show. So, as you guys may know, I am a really big comic book nerd. I love comic books, I love superheroes, and I love that kind of side of pop culture. However, one character that's never really clicked for me all of my time in reading books and has never really enticed me to read on or read more or even watch some of the shows and movies that he's been in has been Clark Kent, aka Superman. And I know a lot of people feel the same because a lot of people have the same issue I had with him. Essentially, he is just a Boy Scout. He's got these ungodly like powers where you never feel like he'll ever be defeated. You have this sort of sense that he is pretty much invincible. Like, he's never going to be beaten, and he's always right. Like, he's always doing the right thing, and never really is any flaw or consequence within his character. And to be fair, if you were to just read from Action Comics #1 and kind of read all of the early adaptations of Superman, when superheroes in general weren't really these complex characters, they were more one if not two-dimensional characters that were just there to be entertainment for kids and teenagers. They were, you know, your Saturday morning cartoon show, if you will, back in the 30s and 40s. That's basically what comic books were. They weren't meant to be these complex stories. It wasn't until really the Silver Age until we started getting really in-depth comic book stories. We had a few here and there, but Superman generally just was this guy who just kicked ass. It wasn't until later stories where a lot of lore would end up be added to the character. So I do understand why people had this perception, and I was under this same idea as well. And yes, I'd seen the films like Man of Steel and everything. I had a general understanding of Superman. But it wasn't until this new show that many of you will know, My Adventures with Superman, which came out, produced by Adult Swim and Warner Bros. And this show is actually really, really good. And as a massive comic book fan that has been reading comics for years and years and years, as someone like me who finds it quite easy to just jump into a comic book because they know what to expect, they kind of know how comics work, Superman was always one of the most difficult characters to jump in on. However, this show is a major accessing point to the character and gives you a very general but very complex understanding on who Clark Kent is and gives you a lot of depth to his character. The show does this by giving it a very light-hearted approach, and it's quite easy to connect with the three main characters, Clark, Jimmy, and of course, Lois Lane. But then the show isn't even episodic as you'd probably imagine it to be. No, it's actually a serialized show that has overarching stories, not just in the individual seasons, but over both seasons as a whole as well. It introduces characters slowly like Lex Luthor and Brainiac and Supergirl and gives you time to really understand what the characters' motives are and what they are about. It also does a good job at simplifying some of Superman's more lesser known villains for audiences like myself at the time who didn't really know too much about Superman to be able to connect with those villains as well and understand who they're about. Like if I went to go and read a comic book with one of those villains that appeared in the show, I'd find it a lot easier to understand that character and kind of move forward from there. Not only that, but I think the show understands that a lot of people who will be watching this will be new to Superman, because one of the major storytelling points in the show actually tackles the idea of the consequences of Superman. Like I mentioned, a lot of people before they get into Superman kind of just think he's this perfect character, and that's why a lot of people fail to appeal to the idea of the character. But this show kind of, in a sort of meta way, takes this criticism and sort of rolls with it as a main story. A big talking point throughout the show is how Clark Kent fits in the modern world and the consequences that Superman brings to the world and Metropolis. They even like to play around with his identity as well, and even when Lois ends up finding out that Clark is Superman, there's still this looming thought over the show, oh, is Lois gonna accept who I am because I'm an alien? It's some really interesting stuff, and it provides some really cool character conflict. Not only that, speaking Speaking of Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, these characters are also fleshed out really well as well, and I was not expecting going into this type of show for characters like Lois and Jimmy to be fleshed out as nearly as much as they were. It almost gave me Spectacular Spider-Man vibes with how well these characters were fleshed out. In Spectacular Spider-Man, we know that Greg Weisman and the team who made that show spent a lot of time with some of the side characters in Peter's high school because they felt like it sort of made the world around Peter feel more alive. Characters like Gwen Stacy, Liz Allen, Flash Thompson, they all got stories of their own, whether they were in the forefront of some of the episodes or whether they were just in the background, sort of acting over the whole season. And My Adventures with Superman sort of does the same thing as well, which I think is really interesting. And come to the end of season 2, I really like the story that they're setting up for Kara as well, and I can't wait to see what happens with her in season 3 and her redemption into becoming Supergirl. I think that's going to be a really interesting story, and I think the way that they've slowly integrated that character into the show has worked really well. And as someone who, as I mentioned, isn't too privy to Superman stories and is more or less sort of learning more about Superman now in the last few years, I find this way of introducing characters like Kara really accessible, and I now feel like I can go on and read some Supergirl comic books and have a larger understanding of the character than if I was to just jump in them straight away and possibly not enjoy them as much. But yeah, if you're trying to get into Superman and you're sort of under this philosophy that Superman is boring, he's a Boy Scout, his powers make him basically godly, I'd highly recommend you to watch My Adventures with Superman because it is really accessible and it's a really easy way to understand the character of Superman and some of the stories and some of the consequences this character has to deal with on a daily basis. It tackles all the main themes of the character in a very concise way and in a serialized manner as well, allowing you to get to know some of these characters and what they're about and some of the villains in a more concise way than if you were to just jump straight in with the comic books and not really know too much about them. So yeah, I highly recommend to watch the show if you haven't already. But if you do love comic books, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We upload every single week. Here are some videos on the screen right now. If you enjoyed this one, you're sure to love these as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care and peace.